A racist white woman throws her drink in a black waiter's face. She is shocked when the black man gets his revenge. The clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversations floated through the restaurant as Nathan Collins adjusted his tie in the staff area, taking a final steadying breath. The upscale crowd tonight seemed even livelier than usual, and he could feel the weight of dozens of expectant eyes sizing up his every move. Tonight would be no different. He knew the routine by heart. Serve with a smile, keep calm, keep moving. When he approached the table in the corner, his usual polished expression slipped ever so slightly. Seated there was a woman he'd been warned about. Rebecca Hastings was a regular, a high-powered executive type in her early 40s, dressed immaculately and glancing at her phone with an air of visible impatience. She didn't look up as he approached, as if he wasn't there at all. "Good evening, ma'am," Nathan greeted, keeping his tone as smooth as ever. "Can I start you off with some sparkling or still water?" Rebecca's eyes barely flickered in his direction. She sighed, a loud, dramatic sound that seemed intended for everyone nearby to hear. "Sparkling, I suppose. And hurry. My time is valuable." Nathan felt his jaw tighten just slightly but kept his expression neutral. He'd handled worse. "Right away," he said, nodding politely and heading to the bar. Behind him, he caught a murmur from Rebecca's table, her voice low but pointed. "I can't believe they've hired someone like him here. This place used to have standards." The comment hit harder than Nathan cared to admit. His grip on the water bottle tightened momentarily before he took another breath, steadying himself. It wasn't the first time he'd dealt with people like Rebecca. He knew the type, people who assumed his position somehow said something about his character, his worth. When he returned to her table, bottle in hand, Rebecca's attention was still on her phone. "Here's your water, ma'am," he said evenly, pouring it with precision. Her eyes finally lifted, studying him like she might an insect that had somehow wandered onto her table. "You're new, aren't you?" Her voice was dismissive, each word a little barb. Nathan set the bottle down carefully. "I've worked here a while now, actually," he replied, a subtle edge to his tone. She raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on her lips. "Huh. Doesn't show. I just assumed, you know." Her eyes flicked down and up, taking him in before returning to her phone. There it was. Nathan felt a brief, fiery urge to say something, anything, that would remind her he was just as human as she was. But the years had taught him patience. He knew better than to waste words on someone who wouldn't hear them. "I'll be back shortly to take your order, ma'am," he said instead, his voice calm and measured. Without waiting for her response, he turned and made his way to the next table, his steps steady. As he moved between tables, Nathan tried to shake off the encounter. But Rebecca's comment lingered, a reminder that for some people, his efforts to excel in his role meant nothing. And there she sat, in one of the city's finest restaurants, as if it all belonged to her. At least for now, he would remain professional. He'd keep serving with a smile, just like he'd done every day before. But he couldn't help the thought that someday, people like Rebecca would get a little reminder that not everything in life would bend to their privilege. Nathan continued his rounds, his focus steady as he moved from table to table, putting his encounter with Rebecca behind him as best as he could. Each polite exchange, each genuine smile from other patrons, served as a reminder of why he loved his job despite moments like these. But as he approached Rebecca's table once more, he felt a prickling sense of unease. Rebecca sat with her arms crossed, her gaze hard and impatient as she watched him approach. "Well, it's about time," she said, her voice edged with irritation. "I've been sitting here waiting for a simple drink order like this place has all day." "Apologies for the wait, ma'am," Nathan replied evenly, setting the glass down in front of her. He kept his expression calm, steady. "Is there anything else I can bring you right now?" She picked up the glass and gave him a long, scrutinizing look before taking a slow sip. Setting the glass down, she leaned back, her gaze sharp. "I don't mean to be rude," she began, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I can't help but notice how the standards here have shifted recently. You know, back in the day, this restaurant wouldn't have needed a diversity quota to fill its staff." Nathan's expression didn't falter, but he felt the sting of her words, sharp and deliberate. "Ma'am, I assure you everyone here is hired for their qualifications. Is that right?" She smirked as if amused. "Look, I'm just saying it's obvious what they're doing. A place like this trying to show they're inclusive." She gave a little scoff, waving a hand. "But I suppose that's just how things are now. We have to make space, even if it means the quality slips a bit." Nathan clenched his hands behind his back. the tension building as he fought to keep his face composed. "I'm here to make sure your experience is as good as it can be, ma'am. If there's anything specific you'd like, I'll be happy to get it." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, as if daring him to break. "Sure, I'll have the seared salmon. And please, make sure it's prepared to the restaurant's usual standards." Her emphasis on usual was a thinly veiled dig, her gaze still fixed on him with the same scrutinizing judgment she'd worn since he first approached her. "Of course, ma'am. I'll see to it." Nathan inclined his head, turning to walk back to the kitchen. But as he did, her voice followed him, loud enough to turn heads nearby. "It's really a shame how much standards have slipped, but I suppose these days we have to make everyone feel welcome. No matter what." He felt the weight of her words pressing down, each one a deliberate cut meant to diminish him. He held his head high as he passed other tables, pushing down the frustration building in his chest. He'd faced this kind of prejudice before, and he knew how to handle it. But tonight, the sense of injustice lingered, her words leaving a bitter aftertaste. Returning to the kitchen, he relayed the order to the chef with a steady voice, but the anger simmered under his calm exterior, each of her pointed insults striking deeper than the last. Nathan's patience was thin as a thread as he moved between tables, his usual calm battered by the relentless wave of insults from Rebecca's table. Every sharp word, every contemptuous look, and especially her insinuation about him being a diversity hire, burned in his mind, each one a barb that cut deeper. He was used to rude customers, but her complete brazen disrespect had made this evening unlike any other. Across the room he saw her raise her hand again, waving him down with an exaggerated motion and tapping her empty glass against the table as if to further humiliate him. Taking a deep breath, Nathan approached, forcing his tone to stay even. "Ma'am, would you like a refill?" he asked, his voice clipped but calm. Rebecca didn't answer immediately, just looked him over with that smug, disdainful smirk. "Well, you finally decided to show up," she sneered, "and here I was starting to think service standards just didn't matter to you people." Nathan felt a flicker of anger, but he forced himself to nod. "I apologize for the wait," he replied tersely. "I'll bring your drink right away." "Oh, I'm sure you will," she said, voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "They probably only keep you around because you make the place look inclusive and right. After all, they wouldn't want to appear biased." Nathan felt the last of his patience slip away, the fire in his chest rising to a breaking point. He squared his shoulders, meeting her gaze directly. "Ma'am, I earned my place here, just like anyone else." Rebecca let out a harsh laugh, the sound sharp and cold. "Earned it? Let's not kid ourselves. You're nothing more than a token. They needed someone to fill a quota, and you were convenient. You should be grateful they even let you in here." He took a small step forward, his voice low but pointed. "Respect is a two-way street, ma'am. If you want it, try showing a little of it first." Rebecca's face twisted in rage, and before he could react, she grabbed her glass and threw the remaining water directly at him. The icy liquid splashed across his face and shirt, soaking him instantly. Gasps filled the room as the other patrons turned to watch the scene unfold, their expressions ranging from shock to quiet outrage. For a moment, Nathan stood there dripping, his eyes locked on Rebecca's smug, triumphant expression. But instead of retreating, he felt his own anger spill over, no longer containable. "Oh, don't worry, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I'll get you that refill. Maybe I'll even rush a little, since I wouldn't want to waste any more of your precious time." Her mouth dropped open, stunned, but she quickly regained her composure, her face contorting with fury. "Excuse me? Who do you think you're talking to?" "Someone who thinks they're owed respect without showing any in return," he shot back, his tone unyielding. "Someone who believes money lets them treat others like trash." Rebecca's face turned red, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that? You're just an entitled little server who has no idea who he's dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Nathan said coldly. "And I think everyone here does too." Rebecca's eyes blazed as she opened her mouth. But before she could respond, James, the restaurant manager, approached, his expression firm as he looked between them. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice steady but with a clear note of authority. Rebecca turned to him instantly, latching onto his presence as her chance to regain control. "Yes, there's a problem. This server was rude, and I demand that he be fired immediately. I won't be insulted by some quota filler." James's gaze shifted from Nathan, soaked from the thrown water, to Rebecca, whose face was twisted with anger. He took a measured breath, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, we have a strict policy against abusive behavior toward our staff. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Her eyes widened in shock, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. "You're asking me to leave? I am a paying customer." "Yes, ma'am," James replied, his tone resolute. "This is your final warning. We're happy to refund your meal, but I need you to leave the restaurant." Rebecca shook her head, her rage intensifying as she crossed her arms. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "I am not going anywhere until this man is fired. I will not be thrown out like some nobody." James sighed, nodding to the hostess to summon security. "Ma'am, if you refuse to leave, we'll have to call security." Rebecca's face twisted further, her eyes wild with fury as she realized her defiance was only drawing more attention from the surrounding tables. "Call them," she spat. "Let everyone see how this place treats its best clients. I know people in this city, important people." James simply waited, his gaze unwavering. Security arrived within moments, standing politely but firmly near the door, making it clear she was no longer welcome. Realizing she had no choice, Rebecca snatched up her coat and bag, her mouth set in a rigid, furious line as she prepared to leave. But as she stormed toward the exit, she turned back one last time, glaring directly at Nathan. "This is why you people don't belong here," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "No sense of respect, no class, nothing but entitlement. You'll never be anything but help, no matter where they let you in." The room was silent, every patron staring in stunned disbelief. Nathan felt the weight of her words, the ugliness and bile, but he stood tall, unflinching. He met her gaze, his voice steady. "And yet, here I am, still standing." Rebecca let out a furious huff, then spun on her heel and stormed out, the door swinging shut behind her with a final satisfying thud. The restaurant remained quiet, the gravity of her words lingering heavily in the air. Several patrons looked at Nathan, some offering sympathetic nods, a few whispering words of support. For the first time that evening, he felt a sense of victory. Whatever power she thought she had, it had crumbled as soon as she revealed who she really was. James put a hand on Nathan's shoulder, his expression sympathetic. "You handled that well. I'm sorry you had to go through it." Nathan nodded, his face still damp, but his spirit steady. "Thanks, James. I appreciate it." As he returned to his rounds, he knew that, no matter what came next, he wouldn't let people like Rebecca Hastings bring him down. The restaurant had gradually returned to its usual hum of quiet conversation and clinking glasses after Rebecca's dramatic exit. But the tension lingered. Patrons occasionally glanced at Nathan, some nodding with silent approval, others offering sympathetic smiles. It was as though the entire room had silently rallied around him, their quiet solidarity bolstering his spirits. As he continued his rounds, James pulled him aside, his expression firm but reassuring. "Nathan, I wanted to make sure you're all right after all of that." James gestured vaguely toward the door, where Rebecca had made her spectacle. Nathan let out a long breath, feeling the last of his anger ebb away. "Yeah, I'm good. Just tired of dealing with people like her." James nodded, his face softening. "She's not the first, and I doubt she'll be the last. But you handled it well. Stood your ground, even when she lost control." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "And don't worry, if she tries to follow through on her threats, we'll handle it. You won't be facing this alone." "Thank you, James," Nathan replied, feeling the weight lift a little more. "I really appreciate it." They both returned to their respective duties, but as Nathan went about the rest of his shift, he couldn't shake the memory of Rebecca's final, hateful words. Even now, they echoed in his mind, mingling with the satisfaction of watching her forced to leave. He'd faced people like her before, but rarely had anyone so openly displayed their prejudice and entitlement. As the night wound down, Nathan couldn't help but wonder if that was truly the last he'd see of Rebecca Hastings. Something about the look in her eyes, that cold certainty that her power extended beyond the walls of the restaurant, left him uneasy. He had seen that kind of entitlement before, the belief that money and connections could shield her from the consequences of her actions. The following day, Nathan's lingering unease proved valid. He arrived at the restaurant for his evening shift to find a few of his co-workers glancing at him with strange expressions, some supportive, others a little worried. When he reached the staff area, James was waiting, holding a file in one hand, his face more serious than usual. "Nathan," James said, motioning him to sit. "It seems we're not quite done with Ms. Hastings after all." Nathan's stomach dropped. What happened? James sighed, flipping through the file. She sent a formal complaint to management, claiming you were rude and unprofessional, that you embarrassed her in front of other patrons and, he paused, a note of anger flashing in his eyes, that you harassed her based on her race. Nathan felt a hot flush of anger rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. She threw her drink at me, James, and everyone saw how she spoke to me. I know, and that's exactly what I told management, James assured him. We have the testimonies of at least 5 patrons who witnessed the incident, all corroborating your side of the story. Nathan exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. But why go this far? She already humiliated herself. Why can't she just leave it? James gave a small, bitter smile. People like her aren't used to being told no. She expects everyone to bow down to her demands, and when they don't, she lashes out. But don't worry, management's on our side. They know what kind of person she is. They've seen complaints like hers before. Empty threats from people who think their status means they're untouchable. Nathan's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the anger still simmered. Thank you, James. I appreciate it. James gave him a firm nod. You're one of our best servers, Nathan. We're not letting you go over someone like her. This is just a formality, something we have to address. She's not coming back here. With that reassurance, Nathan began his shift. But the encounter with Rebecca left a mark. He felt a lingering tension, wondering if she'd continue her campaign against him outside the restaurant. A week later, as Nathan was finishing up his shift, he saw a familiar figure walk through the door. Rebecca Hastings, looking as smug and entitled as she had the night of her confrontation with him. Her eyes scanned the restaurant before locking onto Nathan, and she marched over, her expression hard and unyielding. Nathan, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Still here, I see. Clearly this place has no standards left. Nathan kept his expression calm, though his jaw tightened. Ma'am, if you're here to dine, please take a seat. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave. Rebecca let out a laugh, loud and mocking. You think you're in a position to ask me to leave? She sneered. I'm here because I just found out this restaurant had the nerve to ban me, and I intend to let your manager know exactly what I think of that decision. You were asked to leave for how you treated me and others, and there's no reason to repeat it, Nathan replied, his tone firm. You can respect our policies, or you can go somewhere else. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice lowering to a venomous whisper. You think this place cares about you? The only reason you're still here is because they want to look inclusive. Without their precious diversity quota, you'd be cleaning the streets, if even that. The words were like a slap, sharp and cutting. Nathan took a deep breath, fighting to hold his ground. I'm here because I'm good at my job, he said coldly. Something you'll never understand. All you know is how to treat people like they're beneath you. Her smirk widened. People like you? Pretending you belong? It's always so obvious. No matter how hard you try to fit in, you're still just, well, you. Nathan clenched his fists, feeling the burn of her words in his chest. She stood there, relishing every insult, as if daring him to respond. He met her gaze, refusing to look away. Oh, don't you worry, she continued, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. The higher you try to climb, the harder you'll fall. People like me have seen it before. All you'll ever be is the help. She watched him, her smile growing as he absorbed each venomous word. But Nathan wasn't backing down this time. He'd had enough. Just then, James appeared beside them, his expression grave as he looked between the two. Ms. Hastings, we've already discussed this. You were banned for your behavior toward our staff, and that decision stands. Rebecca's eyes flashed as she turned her attention to James. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? I know people who could ruin this place. James's face was calm, his voice steady. Ma'am, this restaurant upholds respect and equality for both its patrons and staff. You violated those values, and that's why we won't be serving you anymore. Rebecca scoffed, crossing her arms defiantly. This is about protecting your little token over here, isn't it? She spat, gesturing at Nathan. You're afraid of bad press, aren't you? Think this little charade will make you look like heroes? Nathan raised an eyebrow, a trace of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Or maybe, he said, his voice calm. They're just tired of people like you treating others like they're beneath them. She turned on him, eyes blazing. You don't belong in places like this, and you never will. The only reason you're here is because they need a quota. You're just here for the pictures and PR. Nathan met her gaze, his anger no longer hidden. Funny, considering the only thing you bring to places like this is a reminder of why these policies exist in the first place. James stepped forward, cutting in before she could respond. Ms. Hastings, if you refuse to leave, we'll call security. This is your last chance. Her face flushed with anger, her jaw set in a hard line. Oh, don't worry. I'll leave. But don't think for a second this is over. She shot Nathan one final look of contempt. You people will never get it. Thinking you can belong in places like this. With that, she turned and stormed toward the door, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor, every step brimming with fury. Nathan watched her go, a sense of finality settling over him as she disappeared through the door for good. He knew she wouldn't be back. James turned to him. His expression softened. You okay, Nathan? Nathan nodded, his voice steady. Yeah, thanks for standing up for me. James gave him a supportive nod. You handled that well. If she tries anything else, we're all behind you. The following day, Nathan couldn't shake the bitterness lingering from his last encounter with Rebecca Hastings. Her sneering words echoed in his mind, each insult sharper than the last. The more he thought about it, the more he knew he couldn't just let it slide. People like her walked around untouchable, shielded by their status and entitlement, thinking they could treat others however they pleased. But enough was enough. Later that evening, as Nathan wrapped up his shift, James approached him with a curious expression. Nathan, I just got an unusual call, James said. It's from HR at Rebecca Hastings' company. They're asking if you'd come in to share your account of what happened last week. Nathan's eyebrows rose in surprise. Her company actually reached out? James nodded. Apparently someone tipped them off. Could have been a customer who witnessed it. They're investigating her behavior and want a full account from you. A surge of satisfaction stirred in Nathan. This was a rare chance to make her accountable. I'll do it. And if they want proof, I can even bring security footage from the restaurant. The following day, Nathan arrived at the consulting firm's office building, a sleek, intimidating tower of glass and steel. The receptionist led him to a conference room where a woman greeted him with a firm handshake. Mr. Collins, thank you for coming in, she said, introducing herself as Pauline Miller, the head of HR. She gestured for him to sit. We've received some concerning reports about Ms. Hastings' behavior, and we're here to understand exactly what happened. Nathan nodded, appreciating her professionalism. I'm happy to explain. I also have security footage from the restaurant that shows what took place. Excellent, Pauline replied, her voice measured. We want to ensure we have all perspectives. Please know we're committed to handling this fairly. Just as Nathan started explaining, the door opened abruptly, and in strode Rebecca Hastings herself, her expression darkening the moment she saw him. She took the seat opposite him with a smug, hostile glance. Oh, you've got to be kidding me, she muttered. So this is what it's come to, dragging me here over this nonsense. Pauline raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. Ms. Hastings, please remember this is a professional inquiry. We'll need you to remain civil as we proceed. Rebecca scoffed, crossing her arms. Professional? You're actually listening to him? Over me? Pauline held her gaze without flinching. This investigation is standard, Ms. Hastings. We're here to gather information from all involved. Nathan began recounting the events in detail, starting with her hostile tone, her condescending remarks, and culminating in the moment she threw her drink in his face. He stayed calm, detailing how she'd insulted him, with her final words echoing in his mind. You people will never get it, thinking you can belong in places like this. As he finished, Pauline turned to Rebecca. Ms. Hastings, do you have a response to this account? Rebecca's face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. He's twisting everything to make himself look like the victim. The service was slow, and I didn't deserve to be treated rudely just because I expected a little respect. Nathan held her gaze. I was polite and professional until you crossed the line. Pauline glanced at him. You mentioned security footage? Nathan pulled out his phone, connecting it to a display screen. The footage showed the entire incident, from Rebecca's tense body language to the exact moment she threw her drink at him. As the video played, Pauline's expression hardened. When it finished, Pauline turned back to Rebecca, her face stern. Ms. Hastings, this behavior is unacceptable by any standard, let alone our own company's values. Rebecca's expression twisted, and she shot Nathan a venomous look. So what now? He's trying to ruin my career because I dared to tell him the truth. Pauline remained unshaken. This isn't about speaking your mind. It's about actions and the impact they have on others. This behavior not only undermines our company's values but also reflects poorly on everyone associated with you in a professional setting. Rebecca's face turned red, her voice rising. You're really taking his side? Over me? Do you know what this could mean for the company? Ms. Hastings, Pauline replied, her tone steady. We have a responsibility to uphold a standard of respect, integrity, and inclusivity. Given the severity of this incident and the evidence presented, we are suspending you, effective immediately, pending further review. Rebecca stood up, nearly knocking her chair over, as she pointed a trembling finger at Nathan. You think you've won, don't you? You think this little display of self-righteousness will get you anywhere? Nathan met her gaze steadily, unbothered by her outburst. I think people deserve respect, no matter their job title. It's something you might learn now. Her mouth twisted in fury, but before she could respond, Pauline interjected. Ms. Hastings, you're excused. Security will escort you out. Rebecca's mouth opened in shock, but after a tense silence, she snatched up her purse, throwing Nathan one last look of disdain. People like you don't belong here, and you never will, she hissed, before storming out, the door slamming behind her. Pauline let out a breath, turning to Nathan. Thank you again for coming in. We'll be finalizing our investigation shortly, but please know we take incidents like this seriously. Nathan rose, shaking her hand firmly. Thank you for taking the time to listen. As he left the office, a feeling of closure washed over him. He'd stood up, not just for himself, but for anyone who'd ever been treated the way Rebecca had treated him. She'd finally faced consequences for her actions, and Nathan knew he'd done the right thing. In the days following his meeting at the consulting firm, Nathan felt a renewed sense of confidence and peace. He had faced Rebecca Hastings at her own company and made his case with integrity, finally watching someone like her face real consequences. It was an empowering feeling, knowing he had the courage to stand up and be heard. Word of the incident spread among his co-workers at the restaurant, and he felt their support in small gestures, an extra hand with tables, a sympathetic nod, and the occasional, "Good for you, man," from colleagues who'd heard about what happened. The patrons, too, seemed more attentive, some even sharing stories of standing up against prejudice or offering quiet thanks for speaking out. As he continued through his shifts, Nathan was grateful for the sense of solidarity around him. He saw how much his actions had resonated with others, giving them permission to confront their own injustices and to believe that accountability was possible. One evening, as the dinner rush began to slow, James approached him with a curious smile. "Nathan, there's someone here who wants to speak with you," he said, nodding toward the hostess stand. Nathan turned to see Pauline Miller from the consulting firm standing there, looking around the restaurant with a warm smile as she spotted him. Surprised but intrigued, he made his way over to greet her. "Ms. Miller," he said, extending his hand. "Good to see you." "Please call me Pauline," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I wanted to stop by to thank you in person and to let you know how things ended with Ms. Hastings. She won't be returning to our company." Nathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I appreciate you telling me that. I wasn't sure if anything would come of it, but I'm glad her actions finally caught up with her." Pauline nodded, her expression sincere. "What you did took courage, Nathan. Many people would have looked the other way or stayed silent. But by speaking up, you reminded all of us that values mean nothing if they aren't backed by action." She paused, glancing around the restaurant. "Your team and your manager spoke very highly of you. It's clear you're respected here, and I can see why." Nathan felt a swell of gratitude and pride. "Thank you, Pauline. It means a lot to hear that. And it's nice to know people care about integrity as much as they say they do." Pauline smiled warmly. "Well, if you ever decide you're interested in a career shift, I'd be more than happy to arrange an interview for you. People like you, the ones who stand up for what's right, are exactly the kind of team members we're always looking for." Nathan blinked, caught off guard. That's very generous of you. Thank you. I'll definitely think about it." With a final handshake, Pauline turned to leave, pausing only to give him an encouraging nod. As she exited, Nathan felt the weight of everything he'd been through lift. He'd taken a stand, and it hadn't just made a difference for him. It had resonated with others, creating ripples he hadn't even expected. Over the next few weeks, things settled back into a familiar rhythm, but Nathan felt a stronger sense of purpose than he had before. He'd learned that respect wasn't something you could expect to receive passively. It was something you had to stand up for, even in the face of intimidation and prejudice. One evening, as he was closing up, James clapped him on the shoulder. "Proud of you, Nathan," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "You handled everything with integrity. And now you're a legend around here." Nathan laughed, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "Thanks, James. I just hope it'll make a difference. Maybe help someone else see they don't have to put up with people like her. You already have, trust me. James grinned. Now let's get out of here. Time to celebrate a job well done. As they finished closing the restaurant, Nathan felt a renewed sense of belonging, not just at his job, but in the world around him. For the first time, he knew he could face whatever came next with his head held high. And that feeling, he realized, was worth everything. A few weeks had passed since Nathan's last encounter with Rebecca Hastings. Life at the restaurant was going smoothly, and Nathan finally felt a sense of closure. But on a sunny Saturday afternoon, as he strolled through the city enjoying his day off, he suddenly heard a familiar venomous voice ring out behind him. Well, well, look who thinks he's a free man, Rebecca sneered. Nathan turned, feeling a wave of frustration surge through him. Rebecca Hastings stood a few feet away, her face twisted with fury. She looked noticeably different. Her usual polished appearance was replaced with a weariness and anger that seemed to have carved lines of resentment into her expression. "Didn't expect to see you here, Rebecca," he replied coolly. "Out enjoying a casual stroll after losing your job?" Her face reddened instantly. "You think you're clever, don't you? I'm sure you're just thrilled with yourself, ruining people's lives just to feel important." Nathan gave her a dry smile. "I wouldn't say ruining lives is my goal, but if the shoe fits..." Rebecca's mouth dropped open, her eyes flashing with rage. She took a step closer, pointing a manicured finger in his face. "You little nobody. You think you can just walk away from what you did to me?" Nathan looked down at her finger, then slowly back up to her face, his expression smug. "What I did to you? You mean exposing you for what you are?" "Yeah, Rebecca. I can live with that." Her face flushed an even deeper red as her hands clenched into fists. "I was someone in this city. I had a career, connections, people who respected me, until you came along with your little victim act." Nathan chuckled, crossing his arms. "Victim act? From where I'm standing, you're the one acting like a victim. You tried walking all over me, and now you're mad because I didn't let you." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and she leaned in, her voice a low, harsh whisper. "People like you don't get to tell people like me how to behave. You should have been grateful just to have a job at a place like that. Instead, you ran to my company like a sniveling little tattletale." Nathan smirked, meeting her glare head-on. "People like me? You mean people who don't have to buy respect with a paycheck? I guess that's a hard concept for you to understand." Her composure snapped, and she shoved him hard, catching him off guard. "You're nothing but an arrogant, entitled little insect," she spat, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of passers-by. Nathan steadied himself, but instead of backing down, he took a step closer, his voice mocking. "Arrogant? From where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who can't handle the truth. Must be hard not getting everything handed to you on a silver platter for once." Rebecca's fists clenched as her voice rose. "Don't you dare talk to me like that, you pathetic little servant. That's all you are. A servant who got too big for his britches. You were lucky to be around people like me." Nathan raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Oh, sure. Lucky to deal with someone who can't go 2 sentences without reminding me how important they are. Real privilege." People in the street began to slow down, drawn by the intensity of their argument. Some took out their phones, recording as Rebecca's face turned redder by the second. Her breathing labored with fury. "You ruined my career!" she yelled, her voice cracking as she gestured wildly. "Do you even understand what you've taken from me? You think you're some kind of hero. All you are is a smug, self-important pest who got lucky once." Nathan let out a small, mocking laugh, crossing his arms as he looked at her with a condescending smirk. "If you'd treated people with an ounce of decency, Rebecca, you'd still have your career. But I guess respect is a foreign concept to you." Her face twisted with rage, and without warning, she slapped him hard across the face. The sharp sting burned across his cheek, but he only smiled back, feeling a sense of satisfaction at her loss of control. "Oh, did I touch a nerve?" he said smugly. Poor little Rebecca, finally getting a taste of her own medicine. Rebecca's entire body seemed to tremble with rage, her fists clenched so tight, her knuckles turned white. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You arrogant little—" "Oh, I think I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Nathan interrupted, his tone mocking. "A spoiled, self-important bigot who thinks she's better than everyone else." The crowd around them murmured, clearly shocked by her behavior. A few people started to call out in support of Nathan, their voices cutting through her rage. "You can't treat people like that, lady," a man called out. "Yeah, we all saw what you did. added a woman, phone in hand as she filmed. Rebecca's eyes darted to the crowd, and a flicker of panic crossed her face before she turned back to Nathan, her voice growing louder and more desperate. "This isn't over. People like me don't let people like you get away with this. You're trash. Nothing but a low-class, entitled little nobody who thinks he can play with the big leagues." Nathan shrugged, his expression unbothered. "Well, this nobody seems to be the one coming out on top, don't you think?" With that final dig, she completely lost control. She lunged at him, shoving him hard in the chest, her nails scratching at his shirt as she snarled, "You're nothing! Do you hear me? Nothing!" Nathan stepped back, catching his balance, his voice calm and unshaken. "You're just showing everyone who you really are, Rebecca. Keep going. You're doing my job for me." Just then, 2 police officers pushed through the crowd, drawn by the shouting. The taller officer stepped between them, looking from Rebecca's twisted, furious face to Nathan's calm demeanor. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice authoritative. Rebecca turned on the officer, her voice shrill and frantic. "He's harassing me, following me around, trying to ruin my life." The officer glanced at Nathan, who raised his hands in a relaxed, casual gesture. "Officer, I was walking down the street when she approached me and started this whole thing. There are plenty of witnesses who saw her shove me and slap me." Several people in the crowd nodded, some speaking up. "She's the one who's been yelling," one woman called out. "She slapped him first," another added, showing her phone screen, recording the incident. The officer looked back at Rebecca, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, is that true? Did you hit this man?" Rebecca's face flushed with panic, her voice rising defensively. He's lying. I was defending myself. He's been stalking me." The second officer, who had been watching the videos on bystanders' phones, shook his head. "Ma'am, we've got more than enough evidence here that you were the aggressor." Rebecca's face twisted with fury as she looked back at Nathan, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "You think you've won, don't you? You're just trash. Nothing but an insignificant pest who thinks he deserves to be around people like me." Nathan let out a chuckle, shrugging. "If that's what you need to tell yourself, Rebecca. But I think the only one here acting like trash is you." The officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, we're placing you under arrest for assault and disturbing the peace." Rebecca's mouth dropped open, her voice desperate. "You're arresting me? For him?" The officer didn't waver. "Yes, ma'am. Now please turn around and put your hands behind your back." As the officer moved to cuff her, Rebecca's voice turned shrill. "You can't do this. I'm the victim here. He's the one who's been harassing me." But the crowd's murmurs and the phone cameras told a different story, and her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers led her toward their patrol car, her protests fading as the crowd watched her go. Nathan stood there for a moment, letting out a long, calming breath. A few people approached him, offering pats on the shoulder and supportive words. "Good for you, man." "She deserved that," one woman said, giving him a nod of approval. "Can't believe someone would act like that," another added, shaking his head. Nathan smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him as he thanked them. Rebecca Hastings had finally lost her last shred of control, her actions laid bare for everyone to see. And as he walked away from the scene, he felt a deep sense of closure. She'd been forced to face the consequences of her actions, and he knew he'd finally put her, and her toxic influence, behind him. Later that evening, Nathan returned home, shutting the door behind him and letting out a long breath. The events of the day swirled in his mind. Rebecca's angry tirade, her venomous insults, the way her self-control unraveled in front of the crowd, and finally, her arrest. It had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, alone in the quiet of his apartment, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He dropped his keys on the table and sank into his couch, leaning back and closing his eyes. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he replayed her final words, bitter, hateful, but ultimately powerless. He'd faced her down, stood his ground, and emerged with his dignity intact. All the years he'd spent swallowing his pride, letting comments slide, keeping his head down in the face of entitlement and prejudice. It was as though all of it had culminated in this one moment, giving him a chance to say, enough. As he sat there, he reflected on how much he'd grown from the experience. There was a time when he might have questioned himself, might have let someone like Rebecca Hastings make him feel small or inadequate. But now he realized that he was no longer that person. He'd chosen to stand up, not just for himself, but for anyone who'd ever felt overlooked, belittled, or diminished. He thought back to the people who had supported him, his co-workers who rallied around him, his manager James who had his back, and even the strangers who'd witnessed the confrontation and didn't hesitate to speak up. It was heartening to realize he wasn't alone in his fight for respect and fairness. For so long he'd carried the weight of silence, thinking it was better to avoid conflict, to stay invisible. But this experience had shown him the power of speaking out and the solidarity it could bring. Nathan got up, walked to his window and looked out over the city. The lights twinkled against the evening sky, and he took in the quiet beauty of it. There was something poetic, he thought, in standing here, finally feeling free of her shadow. The whole ordeal had brought him a kind of closure he hadn't known he needed, a validation that people like Rebecca didn't hold all the cards, that arrogance and entitlement could, in fact, be challenged. A faint sense of satisfaction settled within him. He didn't regret a single thing he'd done. If anything, he was grateful for the opportunity to find his voice. He thought of Rebecca, and instead of anger or bitterness, he felt a sense of pity. For all her wealth, status, and connections, she was a person trapped by her own arrogance, unable to see beyond her privilege. She'd learned nothing, and in her refusal to change, she'd lost everything that had once made her feel powerful. In that moment, Nathan realized something important. She no longer had any hold on him. Her power over him had been an illusion, one that shattered the moment he'd chosen to step forward and say, "No more." He smiled, finally feeling the weight lift completely. He'd won, not by retaliating with the same hatred she'd shown, but by standing his ground and letting her actions speak for themselves. People had seen the truth, and he hadn't needed to do anything but be himself, a person who demanded respect, not through titles or status, but by simply being true to his own values. Taking one last look at the city lights, he turned away from the window, feeling at peace. As he prepared for bed, he knew he'd carry this newfound confidence with him, not just at work, but in every part of his life. He'd finally come into his own, and nothing, no one, could take that from him now. With a quiet, contented sigh, Nathan lay down, closed his eyes, and let the calm of the evening wash over him. Whatever tomorrow held, he knew he was ready.